So we'll discuss the anatomy of urinary bladder today. The urinary bladder occupies the pelvic cavity, and in infants its superior surface is slightly above the pelvic inlet because the pelvic cavity is not large enough to accommodate the whole of the urinary bladder. Therefore its superior surface rises above the pelvic inlet. Later, when the pelvic cavity enlarges, then the urinary bladder accommodates in the pelvic cavity. The empty bladder is present in the pelvic cavity. However, when it is filled with urine, its superior surface rises above the pelvic cavity and may reach the hypogastric region. Talking about its anatomy, it has got an apex, a base, a superior surface, and two infralateral surfaces. We cannot see the other infralateral surface from this view, but you can imagine that it has another infralateral surface. It is basically pyramidal in shape. This is the superior surface. This whole surface is the superior surface, and then this is the infralateral surface. Imagine it to be a pyramid which has an apex, a base, a superior surface, an infralateral surface, and the opposite infralateral surface which is not visible from this view. So this is the anatomy of the bladder. It's pyramidal in shape basically when it is empty, but when it is filled with urine, it becomes oval in shape. Okay, so let's talk about the apex. The apex is connected to the umbilicus by means of the median umbilical ligament. Then it is lying just behind the pubis. If you talk about the base or the posterior surface, it is more easy to understand the base or the posterior surface from another diagram. Here you can see the same bladder, but it's not it's without the pelvic cavity. It is actually isolated. So you can see that this is the bladder, the same bladder which we saw over there. The superior surface, the infralateral surface, the apex, and then there is the base. Now consider that you have changed this view so that you're viewing this bladder from the posterior direction. This is the posterior view of the bladder. So this will be the superior surface, and this is the whole posterior surface. So the features which we'll be observing on the posterior surface are two supralateral angles. Since it's triangular in shape, the posterior surface is triangular in shape, therefore it has got two supralateral angles and one inferior angle. At the supralateral angles, we will see the entry of the ureters. There is the right ureter and there is the left ureter. And then there is an inferior angle which gives rise to the urethra. Okay, so what are the remaining features of the posterior surface? We can see that there are two vasa differentia. These are the vasa differentia. And then there are the seminal vesicles. These will be present only in the males. And the two seminal vesicles are separated from each other by these vasa differentia. So these are the features on the posterior surface. One more thing that is of importance is the presence of peritoneum. How peritoneum covers the posterior surface. It's very important to understand this concept. Okay, let me show you in the diagram which shows very nicely how the peritoneum is covering the posterior surface. So this is another diagram of bladder. You're viewing it from a lateral view, but you're viewing the interior of the pelvic cavity. It's the same diagram as we saw before, but the only difference is that we have added peritoneum in this diagram. So talking about peritoneum, you can see this orange layer over here. All this orange layer is the peritoneum, and here you can see that this is the bladder and this is the posterior surface of the bladder. And we can see that the peritoneum is covering only the upper part of the posterior surface. The lower part of the posterior surface of the bladder is devoid of peritoneum. So the upper part of the posterior surface, which is covered with peritoneum, this peritoneum, which is covering this part, forms the anterior wall of the rectovesical pouch. Rectovesical pouch. Recto is for rectum, vesicle is for the urinary bladder. So between these two, there is a pouch called as the rectovesical pouch, and the interior layer of this rectovesical pouch is formed by the peritoneum, which is covering the upper part of the posterior surface. Talking about the lower part of the posterior surface, it is devoid of peritoneum, and it is separated from the rectum by means of seminal vesicles and vasodifferentia and the rectovesical fascia. Rectovesical fascia is present over here. It's not shown in the diagram, but it's actually fascia which is completely filling this area which is below the rectovesical pouch. Okay. So we have discussed the posterior surface. Now we will be talking about the superior surface. Superior surface is actually covered throughout by peritoneum, and the interesting thing about it is that it is very important to know this concept that when the bladder gets filled with urine, and it is completely filled with urine, its superior surface actually rises into the abdominal, into the lower part of the abdominal cavity, and due to this going up, the peritoneum over the anterior abdominal wall is peeled off, due to which the bladder comes into direct contact with the anterior abdominal wall. Okay, so we have discussed the superior surface, and now we will be discussing about the infralateral surfaces. Coming to the diagram that we saw before, the same diagram. Okay, so we have the infralateral surfaces. This surface, you see, this is a superior surface, don't confuse it now. This which I am tracing over here is the infralateral surface. Now the infralateral surface is related anteriorly to the pubis and the retropubic fat. You cannot see retropubic fat in this diagram because any fatty structures have not been shown in this diagram, but there is fat behind the pubis, and that is called as retropubic fat, and that is basically a relation for the anterior part of this infralateral surface. And posteriorly, the infralateral surface is in contact with the obturator internus muscle and the levator ani. This is the levator ani muscle, and this is the obturator internus. If you imagine the other infralateral surface, which can be here, which is here actually, it is in relation with this obturator internus and the levator ani. So this is about the infralateral surface. Now let's talk about the neck of the bladder. To understand the neck of the bladder, we will look at another diagram. Okay, so the neck of the bladder is, as you can see, sorry for the shake in the video. Okay, so this is the neck of the bladder. It is basically the part of the bladder which lies inferiorly, and it is lying or resting on the superior aspect of the prostate. Okay, so this neck of the bladder is important because it is actually the point where the smooth muscle fibers of the bladder become continuous with the smooth muscle of the prostate. Okay, so it's a unique feature at this point, the neck of the bladder. And the neck of the bladder is supported by certain ligaments, which are in males this ligament is called as puboprostatic ligament, and in females it is called as pubovesical ligament. These are actually these ligaments are actually the thickenings, you can say, or the you can say that they are produced from the pelvic fascia. They are thickened layers of pelvic fascia which are supporting the neck of the bladder. Okay, so next we'll be talking about the mucous membrane. Let's talk about the inside of the bladder. Yeah, let's suppose that we have opened up the bladder, alright, and you're viewing it from the inside, and you can see that there's a mucous membrane which is covering the inside of the bladder. Now this mucous membrane is thrown into numerous folds, alright, into numerous folds, and those folds cover the bladder throughout, but there is a small area on the inner surface of the posterior surface of the bladder, on the interior of the posterior surface of the bladder, that is called as trigone. It is a triangular area. The trigone is a triangular area, roughly this area. Alright. This trigone is an area where there are no mucosal folds actually. This is an